Okay, grade nines, welcome back. We're going to take a look at lesson 8 today. It's section 3.3 in the textbook entitled Threats to Biodiversity. There's clearly some homework for you guys to take a look at, and I will be posting the solutions to those homework questions along with this lesson. So, however you learn best, you'll have the resources there, hopefully to complete those questions and then check your answers. Okay, threats to biodiversity. Now, habitat loss means loss of biodiversity. If a thing has no place to live, then it cannot live. Okay? If a species has no habitat to live in, well, then that species is not living. And right now, and we're going to talk about this on the next page, but we see a couple of things on this page: clear cutting, the draining of wetlands, forest fires. And I can't tell if this last picture is a violent storm or a volcanic eruption, but either way, it counts as an event that could cause habitat loss. Okay, so bear those pictures in mind as we move on to the next slide. Now, here's what you have to understand about us as human beings. We tend to not think about sustainable ecosystems. It's a pretty historical fact for us. It actually probably dates back into prehistory. Okay, we tend to move into ecosystems and shift them or affect them in ways that that benefit us, but we don't tend to think about what the implications are to the species that live in those ecosystems. This is even true of prehistoric man, early Homo sapiens, hundreds of thousands of years ago. The fossil record kind of shows that early Homo sapiens, early human beings, would enter into a new area, okay, because they had the ability to make rudimentary tools and fire. They would tend to overhunt, and we notice in the fossil record that species lived in an area, then Homo sapiens showed up in that area, and then shortly thereafter species would disappear from that area. Okay, and we'll talk about what disappear from that area means near the end of this PowerPoint presentation. Okay, we're going to talk about extinction, but that's the word I want you to keep in mind when we think about what happens when a species no longer exists. Okay, now what are some of the things that we do? Okay, we drain wetlands. Okay, we cut down trees and we dam rivers. Okay, these drastically change the makeup of a habitat or ecosystem. Okay, now sometimes habitats are lost or destroyed from natural processes, volcanic eruptions, wildfires, droughts, hurricanes. These are things that necessarily we can't really control, although wildfires might just be within our purview. Our climate change tends to make wildfires a little more common and a little more difficult to stop. But generally speaking, those are events that do happen without our intervention. Okay, and there are human activities too, deforestation, which we'll talk about in a couple of slides here. But there are things that happen naturally, and there are things that we do, and that's a distinction that we have to make. We made it when we talked about the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect exists. These things tend to happen naturally without our intervention, but our intervention tends to accelerate habitat loss to a degree that becomes unbalanced in the ecosystem. Okay. Now, when organisms lose their habitat and there's no alternative, they may not survive, and that threatens biodiversity. If there's no place to live, well, then the species isn't going to survive. Okay. We're going to talk about deforestation in a second. What I want you to do is I want you to take a look at what we're talking about. We're talking about cutting down trees, and we're going to focus particularly on bird species. And here's our fact for deforestation. 55% of our forests here in Canada have been cut down since the 60s, and that's caused a decline in bird species. And we'll talk about that in greater detail in the next slide or two. Okay. So the first thing I want to look at is this graph on the side. Okay, on the bottom, on the x-axis, there's a percent of forest loss, and then along the side, what we're going to see is a series of different countries, and we're going to see what percentage of forest they have lost between 1990 and 2005. That's 15 years. Okay, that's not a long period of time. Okay, and between that time, look at some of these countries here. There's greater than 50% lost forest space. Okay, There's greater than 50% lost forest space. So what is deforestation by definition? Deforestation is when we clear the forest completely and we don't replant. Okay, so we cut down all the trees in an area and then we don't replant those trees. Why do we do that? Well, for two reasons. First of all, we want the timber. We need the wood as a building supply or for making paper. The other is we need to clear that area for agriculture. That means we're going to cut down all the tree species. We're going to eliminate the habitat for a lot of the animal and microscopic species in there. Okay, so this huge percentage of biodiversity is eliminated just so we can flatten that land and grow maybe 1 or 2 crops on that land or grow 1 or 2 animals on that land. Okay, so that's a super, super huge reduction in biodiversity. You might have had 1,000 species living in a couple acres of forest. If we cut that down and we're only now raising a couple species of plant and a couple species of animal just for the purpose of us eating those things, well, that's a big deal. Okay. Now, there are lots of different statistics we can look at to describe deforestation. I think this one's fairly staggering. Between 1966 and 94, there's a 55% decrease in trees here in Canada. And that meant there was a decrease in the number of bird species that were living here in Canada from 105 to 67. Okay, that's close to 40 species of birds, 38 species of birds gone from Canada that don't live here anymore because there's no sustainable habitat for them. Okay, so we have a huge impact in a short span of time, and it's hard for the natural world to kind of balance that out. Okay, and the end result is that we potentially could lose huge, huge, huge numbers of plant and animal species. Okay. We take a look at wetlands next. This is another type of ecosystem. What we have here is a series of pictures of some of the animals and plants we might find in wetlands and what those environments look like. Clearly, they're kind of muddy. They're kind of a lot of small ponds, small lakes, maybe a lot of aquatic plants, and a great many of sort of the animals that we find in a pond or a swamp: frogs, dragonflies, snakes, small birds. Otters, very cute example, much cuter than the other examples. But it doesn't matter how cute or attractive we find the animals. What matters is that they are part of biodiversity, is that they have a role to play in the natural world. And if we eliminate their habitat, then we eliminate the animal. And then what happens to their role? Okay. And we talked in the last lesson or the lesson before that about keystone species and species that if we lose those species, then the entire ecosystem collapses, right? Well, we don't want that to happen anywhere. Here's a fact in Ontario. 90% of the wetlands along the coast of Lake Ontario have been destroyed. For what? So that we can build condos and office buildings and townhouses and houses, right? And I know we need places to live. I realize that, but that is a staggering figure that we have eliminated 90% of the wetlands in the area that we live, right? That is a huge change in a very short amount of time. Okay, wetlands generally are areas of land that are covered by water, okay? They're important for many different plant and animal species, okay? Now, obviously, the obvious use is its habitat for many organisms. This is where organisms live, but there's also nutrient cycling purposes, okay? Plants that grow in wetlands, they filter sediment, like the sand and the mud and the soil. They filter that sediment and pollution out of the water, okay? And the problem is that we drain that water. Why? So we can build or so we can farm, okay? We build or we can farm. So we take that huge, huge amount of biodiversity and then we eliminate it just so we can, house ourselves, one species, or maybe house a couple of species for the sake of farming and agriculture. But that is a huge reduction in biodiversity. It's actually staggering numbers. Okay. Now we're going to talk about something called alien species, or we might call them, in some cases, invasive species. Okay, so alien species is not something from another planet. It's a species that's either accidentally or on purpose introduced to a new location. So an organism didn't live in an area, okay? And then something happened, usually human intervention, that causes that animal to now live in a new area. Here's an example: horses. Horses were not native to North America until European settlers began invading North America 400 or 500 years ago. Okay, so even though we have images of horses being a very North American animal, they actually came from Europe. That is an alien species to North America. Okay, but typically alien species arrive by accident, because we have these global shipping lines. We're constantly shipping things by plane and by boat. So we're traveling from different countries that are normally separated by huge bodies of water that species wouldn't be able to cross on their own, but those species are hitching a ride on those modes of transportation, and then they're winding up in a place that they don't naturally live. Okay. Now, a lot of the times, these alien species are kind of harmless. Okay, we don't want it to happen. We don't want alien species to be invading, but generally speaking, very little bad can happen. In some cases, there may be some positivity there, but it's not a big deal. However, sometimes an alien species becomes what we call invasive. And what an invasive species does is it outcompetes the native species and takes over the habitat. Okay, so native species are the natural inhabitants. They're supposed to live there. That's where they've always lived. Okay, invasive species come on in to this new ecosystem all of a sudden, okay, and they start using up all the natural resources. And then what does that do to the native species? Well, the native species then dies out because they can't compete with this new invasive species. They can't eat, they can't find shelter, and so they end up dying. Okay. Here's a couple examples: the zebra mussel and the round gobies. Okay, so zebra mussels are native to Asia, but we find a lot of them in our Great Lakes, like Lake Ontario. And the round gobies, that's the fish there, they're also native to Asia. And what they do is they actually eat the eggs of native fish. Okay, they eat the eggs of native fish. Okay, we can find those in Lake Ontario. Actually, if you fish in Lake Ontario, if you have a fishing permit and you fish in Lake Ontario and you fish out one of these round gobies, the law says you have to kill this round goby. You cannot put it back into the lake. You have to destroy it because it outcompetes our native species. Okay, so zebra mussels native to Asia. They're mollusks. They're in fresh water. I mean, I've had mussels before. Maybe some of you have eaten mussels before. You wouldn't have eaten zebra mussels. Those aren't the type that we eat, but they're a shelled organism. That's what we call a mollusk. Okay. Now, they came into the Great Lakes through ballast water. What is ballast water, you might ask? Well, boats contain what are called ballasts. And ballasts are things that can store water or eliminate water. So if the boat needs to raise itself up in the water, what it'll do is it'll pump water out of its ballast tank, and so the boat becomes a little bit lighter, and so it'll float a little higher in the water. If the boat needs to drop down a little bit, the ballast tanks will take in water, and so the boat will sink a little bit into the water, and it won't be as high out of the water. So because ballast tanks are constantly pulling in water and pushing out water and pulling in water and pushing out water, what happened is they pulled in water, probably somewhere in Asia, probably some shipping boats somewhere in Asia, pulled in water, and with the water came several zebra mussels. And then when they entered into the Great Lakes, like Lake Ontario, they probably emptied their ballast tanks and released these zebra mussels into the Great Lakes. And the problem is they outcompete the mussels that we normally find here in Lake Ontario and the other Great Lakes. And so those other mussel species, they start to decrease in population and die out. Okay. Now, the round gobies, they are a similar idea. They end up in the ballast tanks of boats. Okay. And they breed a lot in Grand Lake Erie shipwrecks. Okay. So there are ships that are wrecked in Lake Erie. Okay. And they outcompete native fish for areas to spawn, that is, mate or reproduce. Okay. And they eat the eggs. So not only do they mate better than our native fish, but they eat the eggs of our native fish as well. So that gives those native fish very little opportunity to survive and reproduce. This is a big one for human beings. Over-exploitation. That means we use or extract a resource until it's gone, okay? And our resources on this planet are not infinite. They are finite. Finite is the opposite of infinite. We will eventually run out of almost all of our resources here on planet Earth, okay? Now, what we do here is we overexploit our resources, and in terms of animal species, that can lead to dangerously low population numbers, if not the complete disappearance. So the example I give you is yellowfish tuna and Atlantic cod, okay? These are fish that we eat. So we consider them a natural resource because it's fish that we send boats out into the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean. We catch these fish, and then we bring them back, and we process them, and we sell them, and we eat them, okay? Now, because we fish these species of fish, we've actually overfished them. And if you look at this graph, what you see is that over the last 50 years or so, the population of Atlantic cod has drastically decreased from 800,000 tons to now 200,000 tons, okay? That's because there aren't enough for us to catch. In 1950, we could have gone out and we could have caught 800,000 tons of Atlantic cod. That's a lot, okay? Today, we cannot go out and catch that because there aren't enough fish for us to be able to catch 800,000 tons. So what fishermen are noticing is, well, we cannot catch the same number of this type of fish that we used to be able to catch because there aren't that many fish in the sea. You know, when they say to you, you broke up with someone, but it's okay because there are plenty of other fish in the sea? That might be true for breakups, but for actual fishing, it's actually not true. The more we fish, the less fish are in the sea, and the less fish that are in the sea, then the less fish there are for us to catch and eat. And so we've actually taken this resource and we've overexploited it to the point where we actually might not have Atlantic cod to eat in the next 20 or 30 years anymore. It might be an extinct species, so we can't eat it anymore because it doesn't exist anymore, okay? Okay, here's another example. We're going to talk about the life cycle of salmon, okay? And salmon are a fish that we like to eat, okay? And they're also fish that bears like to eat, okay? So salmon typically hatch in freshwater streams, okay? I'm sure we've all seen videos of salmon trying to swim against the current of a stream to get to their spawning location. That's the place for them to lay their eggs and mate, okay? So in those freshwater streams, that's where they actually grow, okay? They hatch out of their eggs and they grow, okay? And then what they do is they make their way down the river with the current, okay, towards the Pacific Ocean. And they do what they do. They live from the marine ecosystem, eating, consuming, obtaining nutrients. Then what salmon do is, this is when they swim upriver. So they return to the place that they were born in order to spawn the next generation, okay? That's typically their lifestyle. They're born in a place in fresh water, then they go with the current down back to the Pacific Ocean in salt water, okay? They live their lives. When they're ready to mate, they return back. They swim up river against the current, so they swim back to the place they were born, okay, to lay their own eggs, and that'll be the next generation of salmon, and it repeats. Now, bears, what they do is they actually stand at the edge of the river as the fish are trying to swim upstream, and they actually catch these salmon in their mouths, and that's their food. And that sucks for the salmon because the salmon doesn't get to mate, doesn't make its way upstream to mate, but it's good for the bear because the bear gets a meal. But then what's really important is that the bear eats the salmon, and then it leaves its remains. And the remains decay, and then the plants in the forest, well, they kind of depend on the bears leaving the remains of these salmon, so that the salmon bodies, whatever's left over, can decay and return those nutrients back into the soil, which enters into the plants in the forest, okay? So it's actually an interesting kind of way that these ocean-dwelling salmon, typically living in the ocean, end up providing nutrients for the trees in a forest bordering the Pacific Ocean, okay? Kind of on our west coast, or the United States west coast. We're talking BC, Oregon, and Washington State, maybe in the northern parts of California as well. Okay, so it's a really interesting cycle. Okay, what's the problem? Okay, up to 70% of the nitrogen in plants, trees, insects, birds, and bears in the temperate rainforest come from the Pacific Ocean via salmon. Take that in, 70% of the nitrogen and all of these organisms living in that temperate rainforest on the west coast, okay, come from salmon, come from this process of bears catching salmon and then leaving their remains to be decayed, okay? And of course, the more nutrients, the more biodiversity. The more nutrients there are, the more things that can live. And so you have a ton of species that grow, okay? Now, since the 1880s, salmon populations have decreased 80 to 90%. Okay, that's in 140 years. We have decreased the population of salmon by 80 to 90%. Number one, because we've been overfishing. We eat salmon, so we catch them and we overfish them. And same as the Atlantic cod, we fish too much and now there's less left. Okay, and the other reason is we destroy the salmon's habitat by logging and constructing dams. So when we construct a dam, we block a river or a stream. So now how does the salmon get back to its birthplace? Where's the salmon going to go? The salmon's going to have nowhere to go to respawn. And if it has nowhere to go to respawn, to mate and to produce the next generation, well, then the bear can't catch it. The bear can't eat it, and the bear can't leave its remains. Okay? The reduction in salmon population has been associated with a reduction in the carrying capacity and in the biodiversity of the temperate rainforest. So because the salmon isn't there to get eaten and then leave its remains to provide nutrients, other species that depend on those nutrients, well, they die too. They disappear too. Okay, so what the key point you have to get out here is planet Earth is not unconnected. These are two completely distinct ecosystems. What would the ocean have to do with the Pacific rainforest in BC, Oregon, and Washington? What would those two things ever have to do with each other? How could one affect the other? But clearly we see that because of our actions, we can see a marked change in those ecosystems because we're removing the salmon species. And we can see how that salmon species allows those two ecosystems to interact. So one of the problems is that up until relatively recently in our human history, we couldn't comprehend how connected all these varying ecosystems could possibly be. And now that we're starting to realize it, we're starting to worry, well, maybe it's too late for us to fix this because we didn't realize how connected these ecosystems really, really were. Okay, big word here. Extinction. That means every member of the species dies. Okay. Extinction typically occurs when the death rate of a species consistently remains higher than the birth rate for a long, long period of time. Okay. And there are certain biotic or abiotic features of a species ecosystem that can change that can lead to the death rate surpassing the birth rate. Okay. Here's an abiotic example. If rainfall declines, then plants can't get that water that they need. And so the decline in the rainfall that's consistent can cause plant species to die out. Okay. A biotic example might be the arrival of a new insect species that eats a specific plant species. And if that new species eats too many of that plant species, then eventually that plant species will die out. And so we're talking about the same plant species here, but two different ways it could potentially go extinct. Okay. Now, extinction happens naturally. Okay. So there are differences between patterns of extinction, and the basic difference is the speed at which it occurs. Background extinction is extinction that occurs over long periods of time. Okay, and that means that ecosystems gradually change. That is, I'm not talking about what we do to ecosystems. I'm just saying naturally over thousands, if not millions, if not hundreds of millions of years, ecosystems change. Okay. And over millions of years, species either adapt and evolve, which takes thousands, if not millions of years, or they become extinct. Okay, and you will study evolution and biodiversity a little bit more in grade 11 biology, so I don't want to get too far into it, but those things will come up in grade 11 biology if that's what you plan on taking. Okay, now mass extinction is something that happens very, very suddenly. Okay, and usually it's something that happens to an ecosystem that leaves it unsustainable. And so the big example is the dinosaurs, the extinction at the end of the Cretaceous Tertiary period. We call it the Cretaceous Tertiary extinction, okay? Because an asteroid hit planet Earth. It was a very sudden event. It was a very massive asteroid. And two things happened. Number one, that asteroid hit with such force, it was like hundreds of nuclear bombs going off, And so that immediately raised the temperature, and in the explosion killed millions of species of dinosaurs. Okay. The second thing that happened is that the explosion pushed up so much dust and debris into our atmosphere that it actually blocked out much of the sun's light for thousands of years. And so very quickly, because plants couldn't get that sunlight, plants died out, and then the animals, like the dinosaurs that ate those plants, they couldn't survive anymore, so they died out. Okay, and what was left were little tiny mammals that didn't need a lot of food to survive, and so they kind of won out. But the large dinosaurs, the large species that required lots of plant matter to survive, well, they went extinct. So what happened when the dinosaurs died? Well, the asteroid impact killed many, many, many species, set several species extinct. Okay, and then the dust cloud that was the after effect of the impact, that was the root cause of all the other species of dinosaurs dying out. Okay. By the way, that asteroid, we believe, hit in Mexico, what is now Mexico. Okay. In case you want to look it up, it's a really good Wikipedia article. Just Google asteroid that killed the dinosaurs, and you should be able to find out where the impact crater is for what we believe that asteroid to have been. Okay. Just it's not necessary for you to know, but it might be a little bit of extra reading if you're interested. Okay. Now, here's the problem. Natural extinction happens. Okay. I'm going to go back here. Background extinction happens. Species die, they go extinct, and then other species rise up and biodiversity increases again. So after the dinosaurs died, okay, there was a huge explosion of biodiversity. It wasn't the dinosaurs, it was different species, in particular mammals. It was the rise of the mammals after that kind of took over as being dominant species of this planet. So extinction happens naturally, and then other species fill the gap, and biodiversity returns. Okay, so extinction is not always necessarily a bad thing. It is neither good nor bad. If it's natural extinction, then it is, and it's just part of the evolution of our planet, and it's part of the cycle of life on our planet. Is that species do go extinct? Okay. The problem is that we think the current rate of extinction is 100 to 1,000 times higher than the normal background rate. Okay, and we call that a biodiversity crisis. Okay. Now, I'm going to give you 3 guesses as to why we're facing a biodiversity crisis, but you're only going to need 1. Okay. Why are we going through a biodiversity crisis? It's not an asteroid. Okay. It's not just natural change in our ecosystem and environment. It's our actions. That is, deforestation, habitat destruction, and air and water pollution are rapidly changing the conditions in which species live. Okay. To the point where there are a great many species that can no longer survive within the ecosystem. Okay, so extinction is natural. If we look at the fossil record, what we find is over millions and millions of years, many species have gone extinct, while other species have adapted and evolved. And it's neither good nor bad. Species go extinct or they evolve, but biodiversity generally is maintained in a pretty clear balance. Okay. The problem is our activity accelerates that rate of extinction to the point where other animals and organisms, plants, don't have the opportunity to adapt and maintain biodiversity. And so we're just seeing sharp declines in biodiversity around our planet, and that's our fault, okay? So there is extinction, and then there's the extinction that's caused by human activities. And we have to consider those separately, okay? Want to consider those separately. There's a conversation, I think, in the movie Jurassic Park. It's a great conversation where the owner of, by the way, if you haven't seen Jurassic Park, then that should be your homework, is that you should go check out Jurassic Park. I don't know if it's on Netflix, you have to rent it on Apple TV or whatever it is you do to watch movies. You should watch Jurassic Park. It's a great movie. But there's a conversation. The owner of the Jurassic Park, he has cloned dinosaurs. He's brought them back from extinction. And there was a scientist who says, well, that's a terrible idea. You're messing with nature. And the guy who owns Jurassic Park says, well, what about condors? Condors are extinct. If I brought condors back, would you be complaining? And the scientist says, he says, no. And the difference is dinosaurs, they went extinct naturally. It was not a human activity that caused dinosaurs to go extinct. Humans were not even close to being alive at the time of the dinosaurs. Okay, so they had no involvement in the dinosaurs going extinct. Okay, nature selected dinosaurs. It was natural selection that caused them to go extinct. And so they have no place in our world now because the world has changed. But condors went extinct because our activities caused the condor to die out, and it died out quickly. Okay, so that little conversation, Jurassic Park, and hopefully you watch the movie and you kind of hear that conversation, you can kind of tie that into what we're learning here and have a better understanding of where that conversation in the movie is coming from, because it's a good conversation. It's a good bit of dialogue. Understand the difference between natural extinction and accelerated extinction caused by humans. Okay. I don't know if there was anything else that I wanted to add to that. Oh, one other point that I just realized in my mind that I want to make very, very clear to you about when dinosaurs were alive and when human beings were alive, because I always want to make this distinction to students just in case there's any misconceptions. When did the dinosaurs go extinct? 65 million years ago, okay? Give or take 20 years, okay? 65 million years ago. When did human beings first appear on this planet? When did Homo sapiens, our species, okay, when did we first appear on planet Earth in the fossil record? Somewhere around 100 to 200,000 years ago, okay? So the dinosaurs died and human beings appeared, and the gap of time between those two events happening is huge, okay? Human beings never, ever came anywhere close to walking the planet at the same time that dinosaurs existed. And I want to make that clear because sometimes media or there's certain misconceptions or certain movies kind of make us think that, oh, well, cavemen and dinosaurs existed at the same time, like the Flintstones, okay? No, no. 65 million years ago, the dinosaurs died. That's a long, 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 long time ago. A couple 100,000 years ago, Homo sapiens evolved. Okay? Never, ever. It's not even close. Your brain cannot even comprehend the amount of time that has passed between the extinction of the dinosaurs and the emergence of Homo sapiens. That's how long that period of time is. So I want to make sure that misconception is, and I don't know if anybody has that misconception. Hopefully most of you are kind of going like, no, I knew that. I knew that was just the Flintstones. It was a cartoon and it's not real. That's not the way it was. But I want to make it absolutely sure that that you guys know that, so we don't have that misconception. Okay. I think that's about it for that lesson. That went a little bit long, but I think I kind of got a little sidetracked, which is weird because I'm recording these and you're not here to cause me to go off track. So maybe that was actually my fault. Most of the time I got off topic in class. But until our next lesson, hopefully you stay safe, stay healthy, keep doing the homework and keep learning. Until next time, bye-bye.